The summer of 1945. Three Allied leaders meet at Potsdam in Germany to hammer out the final division of Europe as World War II draws to a close. Here, the victorious Big Three argue over the makeup of post-war Europe. The argument leads to the division of the continent into two camps, East and West. The resulting Cold War will dominate global security for the next 45 years. The compromises made here at Potsdam no longer apply. Germany is one nation, so the armies can go home at last. But that also means that the collective security arrangements that brought Europe its longest period of peace in 1,000 years is also ending. President Bush has talked about a new world order, but who will safeguard Europe in that new world? And what about nuclear weapons? Will the United States continue to hold the umbrella over the continent? In this program, we'll examine the future of European security. I'm Jim Leutze. Join me for Globe Watch.
Краткое изложение заседания Кабинета министров.
A new world order.
New era, an era of stability and cooperation. We are moving from containment to partnership.
Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in early 1933, setting off a chain of events that would bring the horrors of war to large sections of the world. In 1939, Hitler and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin signed a non-aggression pact, allowing them to divide Central and Northern Europe between them. That same year, Canada joined the war as a member of the British Commonwealth. In the summer of 1941, the Germans turned on the Soviet Union, invading that huge nation and pushing it into the arms of the Allies, already united against Hitler. Before the year ended, the United States joined the Allies and tipped the war decisively against Germany. As World War II moved toward its conclusion, the onrushing Soviet and American armies met here on the banks of the Elbe River that cuts through central Germany. The Soviets and the Americans had cooperated in order to defeat Hitler, but that cooperation hardly outlasted the war. There were numerous sources for the tension, especially the Soviet Union's refusal to leave the Eastern European countries it had occupied during the final months of the war. However, the hope of collective security that had guided the failed League of Nations after World War I was still strong after World War II. Despite their differences, both superpowers joined a new collective security organization, the United Nations. Over the next few months, the Western Allies watched with growing alarm as the Soviet Union continued to build an empire. In 1946, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill warned that an Iron Curtain had descended across Europe.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent.
This Iron Curtain became a focal point of American post-war foreign policy. In 1947, American diplomat George Kennan proposed containment as the principal strategy to control Soviet expansion. 2 years later, with the UN effectively paralyzed by Soviet vetoes, the Western Allies formed a new group, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. NATO was designed as a security counterweight to the Soviet satellites expanding in the East.
The NATO function was clearly and explicitly a function addressed to the Soviet threat. It was a response to the awareness that Soviet policy was expansionist, dangerous. It was one of the the earliest and the largest in scale of the manifestations of the containment policy first initiated under President Truman.
The NATO treaty marked the first time the United States entered into a peaceful political alliance with European powers. The organization represented a strong response to the Soviet challenge, backed up with massive military assistance. The battleground for the Cold War expanded as the United States and Soviet Union backed opposing forces in regional conflicts around the world. Then, in 1961, attention turned back to Europe as the Berlin Wall went up, and on each side, fears of a nuclear confrontation grew. I'm standing on a guard tower overlooking the no man's land that once divided East and West Berlin. Here, Soviet and Western troops once faced each other across a border that provided one of the most likely flashpoints for World War III. Then came Gorbachev, Glasnost, Perestroika, and the remarkable revolutions of 1989. In the mid-1980s, Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev began to reform the communist infrastructure, introducing concepts of free speech and free markets. By 1989, those reforms would open the way to the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe and the end of the Soviet Empire. Thus, Gorbachev was important for the action he took, supporting reforms, and the action he didn't take, suppressing dissent. By the end of 1991, those reforms would also cost Gorbachev his job, when the Soviet Union itself dissolved after its republics broke away and declared themselves independent. And once the Soviet Union had ceased to exist, many of the West's security strategies became obsolete overnight. There's no question that NATO helped keep the peace. Moreover, it provided the atmosphere that made the creation of the European community possible. And finally, it provided the United States with an important voice in Europe. The headquarters of NATO are here in Brussels, but since its creation, the United States has been the dominant force. Working together within the alliance encouraged the United States and Europe to forge common policies on other issues, such as trade. Today, such common policies are more difficult to forge. As the threat has faded, so too has the motivation to work together. On both sides of the Atlantic, alternatives to NATO are being considered.
If we, on the two sides of the Atlantic, believe that we want to continue to work together, then I think it's logical that one of the features of the relationship will be defense and security. And how it is expressed may well continue to be on the basis of the North Atlantic Treaty, but the organizations out there in the long term into the next century could be dramatically different. And we may also find that instead of one organization, there are several. We don't know how the Europeans, with an increasingly integrated European community, will take up the question of should there be a European defense organization.
But while the traditional mission of NATO's 16 members was to protect Europe from Soviet expansion, this focus is no longer relevant today. Several organizations are now vying for a security role, including the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, in which the United States is a member, and the Western European Union and European Community, of which it is not. Now that the threat of a superpower nuclear war has diminished, there seems to be less need for America to hold a nuclear umbrella over Europe. The United States and Canada have already cut back on their troops overseas. However, in a controversial paper, some Pentagon planners are proposing that the United States should assume the superpower role of world policeman, thus, among other things, discouraging Germany and Japan from becoming nuclear powers. Former Secretary of Commerce Juanita Krebs questions the wisdom of such a plan.
The primary question is, of course, what will other nations of the world say to the proposition that the United States proposes to be the protector of the world? What will be the role of the United Nations? How will you finance this? The United States really is in no position to continue spending heavily for the defense of the world. It needs to take care of some problems at home, and there was great hue and cry of great joy at the prospect of a peace dividend, which hasn't surfaced so far. But the prospect of reducing defense spending and putting that money into domestic needs is a very appealing one. So I think both at home and abroad, you'll have serious challenges to that proposition.
The Germans, in particular, have taken exception to the concept that the United States might block them from developing a security role to buttress their powerful economic one. And some Europeans now question whether North America should have any role on the continent. But NATO's Secretary General Manfred Warner disagrees.
If you would decouple North America from Europe, most likely Europe would fall back in the power play of the last century or the beginning of this century. And you would have, I think, power struggles which could lead to dangerous situations. So I think you need still the presence, the political presence of North America to deal with the questions of European security in a more stable way. And of course, the United States is, as you know, at this very moment also the only remaining superpower in the full sense of the word. So if you want to build a new international order, you cannot do it without the United States. But let me add that, of course, the United States cannot do the job alone. It's time for the Europeans to assume more responsibilities. And that is why we salute, why we welcome the tendencies in Europe to unite, to form a stronger Europe, to have an own security and defense identity.
France has never wanted the United States, certainly since the time of de Gaulle, to be so closely engaged in Europe, and still resists any form of European defense cooperation which posits NATO as the overarching framework. But I don't think that feeling exists in the majority of informed opinion in any other European country. On the other hand, I think a lot of Europeans, including me, would like Europe to have some sort of identity inside NATO which was a counterpoise to the dominant influence of the United States. And that view, I think, is held in Britain and Germany, and of course would be supported by France.
I really don't know of anyone on the European continent whose, say, strategic aspirations includes getting the U.S. off the continent. Doing a quick survey, the British, the French, the Germans, the Italians, I don't see any of them saying we don't want you around. I can see some of them saying we want a little less of you, we want to run things differently, but we have been saying for a long time we want the Europeans to do more anyway. Now, I'm not sure we're going to be happy the day the Europeans say we're not only going to do more, but we're going to have a louder voice. We're going to have an adjustment period ourselves with this new, larger European partner.
Each European security organization has its limitations. The European community represents only the most powerful Western European countries. The Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe includes 50 nations, a number that could make consensus difficult. And the WEU, while the oldest of the three, has yet to demonstrate its effectiveness. But while these different groups compete for influence, political scientist Robin Dorff says America still represents the greatest military presence in the world.
I think the next 3 to 5 years at least, the American military is still going to be looked upon by many countries and is going to be looked upon by the United Nations as the only military force, and the only military force with the political wherewithal behind it to really be able to take a serious posture in some crises that I expect still will emerge. The Persian Gulf, I don't think we've seen the end of that. I don't expect to see anything along the lines of the war that we had in the beginning of 1991.
In the Gulf War, North America, Europe, and their former enemy, the Soviet Union, united to defeat Saddam Hussein's well-armed military forces. Going to war in the Middle East challenged long-standing arguments that the NATO partners should not fight together outside of Europe. In his request that the United Nations Security Council approve military force in the Persian Gulf, President Bush encouraged collective decision-making in global security.
Together, we should insist that nations seeking our acceptance meet standards of human decency. Where institutions of freedom have lain dormant, the United Nations can offer them new life. These institutions play a crucial role in our quest for a new world order, an order in which no nation must surrender one iota of its own sovereignty, an order characterized by the rule of law rather than the resort to force, the cooperative settlement of disputes rather than anarchy and bloodshed.
The responsibility of the United States for leadership is essentially undiminished, but it has to be leadership within broader-based institutional arrangements, starting with the UN and within the UN Security Council. But I think the U.S. has to be in the position of seeking to develop, put forward ideas to in effect, be a kind of moderator of the resulting deliberations and at the key points bring our weight down in favor of what we think are sensible solutions that will break deadlocks, but at the same time command consensus.
I think we've now got to give much more attention to how we can make the UN work better. It didn't realize its maker's dreams, largely because the Russians were not prepared to join in. And now that the Russians might be prepared to join in, the Soviet Union's disintegrated, and the United Nations itself has deteriorated enormously as an institution since it was first set up.
One major challenge facing the UN today is the question of nuclear proliferation. With the end of the Persian Gulf War came revelations that Iraq was close to producing a nuclear bomb. Despite their defeat, Iraqi leaders continued to resist UN pressure to destroy their capability to produce weapons of mass destruction. This intransigence highlighted fears in the Western world that the arsenals of small, aggressive nations could soon contain the most destructive weapons on Earth, thereby posing an unprecedented threat to global peace and stability. Dennis Healy.
Any country with an industry as modern as Iraq, with a GDP, as you know, about the same as Portugal, one of the poorest members of the European community, nowadays can produce nuclear weapons, can produce, if it doesn't buy them, the missiles to carry them, and probably can conceal the fact that it's building them even from international organizations. It's only because of the circumstances of Iraq's defeat that we discovered that Iraq was only months away from producing an explosive nuclear device.
Another significant test for the New World Order is the growing tension and hostilities between the many ethnic groups in Europe. Historic differences that had been repressed by fears of Soviet reprisal are now surfacing with a vengeance. Many world leaders were caught off guard when Serb and Croat nationalities in Yugoslavia split into a bloody civil war in 1991. For months, the European community united to help negotiate an end to the gunfire. At the same time, the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe gained recognition for its peacemaking efforts in Yugoslavia. Dennis Healy.
I think the big question will be whether it's possible to turn the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, which is a very vague and loose framework, into something stronger and more meaningful, which of course in that case would include also Russia, and Russia, as you know, stretches to the Pacific Ocean. So what I think you could have is a European community which stretches, as I said earlier, from Brest to Brest, inside a new security architecture which stretches from Vancouver to Vladivostok.
We have seen a lot of shift in decision-making power from individual countries to regional organizations. If we look at Europe, for example, attempts by the CSCE, the WEU, the European Community, to become more of a regional actor in political and economic, and even to a certain extent, military affairs. I think that represents a fundamental change in terms of global security and what we've seen in the past.
In addition to ethnic hostilities, some Europeans fear a resurgence of old nationalistic rivalries. Usually this unease focuses on Germany, seen as the aggressor in World Wars I and II. Today, this Germany is reunited and enjoys one of the strongest economies in the world, thanks in part to America's post-war aid and protection. Economic strength gives Germany a stronger voice in European and global affairs and poses new challenges for its allies, including the United States. Alexander Haig.
There's no question that the new Germany, the United Germany, 70-some million people, is going to be a very, very important factor in the future of Europe. I do think that this question will be answered best by whether the United States maintains a presence in Europe, and that credible presence can only be provided by the continuing, although reduced, level of our armed forces in Europe, continuing guarantees in the nuclear area, even though the threat has become somewhat confused, but it's more in anticipation than in reality. And we must not let our reactions precede reality, which we have a tendency to do.
However, during the months following reunification, the Germans began to reassert themselves more aggressively on the global stage. For example, they took a position independent of the European community on Yugoslavia and on interest rates. They also declared German a new diplomatic language, in addition to the traditional English and French.
But this isn't that the Germans want to take over from the United States, restore a new German empire. They don't look at it that way at all. They're far too intelligent. The Germans, like the Japanese, have learned what a benefit it is not to have a very large army and a very large defense industry.
Economic strength will determine the future influence of nations, as competition is based more on economic viability than military muscle. This will raise very real questions for the United States, currently in economic difficulties. But even weakened industrial nations are magnets for growing populations from poorer regions, especially from the Southern Hemisphere and Eastern Europe. These demands will put a huge strain on Europe and North America as it struggles to cope with massive migration. Robin Dorff.
I think the most important developments in global security, one is certainly the shift that we're seeing from the traditional military to the economic. And by economic, I mean not just the potential in terms of protectionism and trade wars being the kind of conflict of the future, but also in terms of population and growth in developing countries. I think, let me put it this way, I think global security is going to be threatened much more by the desires of developing nations to join the developed world, the industrialized world.
When one considers that we're anticipating about 3 billion more people by the year, say, 2015 to 2025, somewhere in that time frame.
Or maybe more.
My goodness, it just becomes enormously apparent, as I say quite often in speeches about energy around the country. Either we help these people achieve an economic base based on a sound energy structure that will produce food and shelter and clothing, or you're going to have to hire more soldiers than you have ever seen.
Growing populations, a shifting balance of power, and nuclear proliferation. These are just a few of the challenges facing global decision makers in this new, uncertain world order. Twice in this century, the United States and Canada were drawn into wars that began in Europe. Now, as the remnants of the last of those wars are being swept away, it is not unreasonable to reconsider America's overseas commitments. Some would argue that the United States should retreat into isolationism, and there are those in Europe who would welcome that. But, in my opinion, isolation is an unattractive option. The larger issue, however, is the new post-Cold War world order. President Bush, among others, has talked about a new world order, but he needs to be far more precise about that vision. Personally, I liked his early emphasis on collective security and the United Nations. After all, it was collective security that won World War I, World War II, and the Cold War. It seems to me to be the best hope for the future.
Travel support for Globe Watch is provided by Lufthansa German Airlines, connecting Charlotte, North Carolina with Europe and the world.